All right, and we're live. Thanks everyone for coming today. This is Book Sandwiched In. My name is Rory Martorana. I am an adult services librarian here at our Ives branch, overlooking the New Haven Green, and I'm with my colleague Gina Bingham, a public services administrator here at NHFPL and the head of our communications team. Today, we are joined by Professor Amanda Tyler, who is the co-writer and co-editor of Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, a life's work fighting for a more perfect union. Amanda is a Shannon Cecil Turner Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where she teaches and writes about the Supreme Court, the federal courts, constitutional law, and civil procedure. She served as a law clerk to the Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the Supreme Court of the US from 1999 until 2000. Just before we jump in, I just want to let everyone know that we do encourage audience questions. If you have something to ask, just please drop it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen so it won't get lost in the chat. Or if you are watching the live stream on Facebook, you can pop a comment in there and we'll be checking that frequently. Amanda, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be with you. As I said earlier, I wish we were in person because I had the privilege of living in New Haven for a year after law school, and I'd love to visit New Haven, especially to get the best pizza in the country. But I'm here to talk about the clerkship I did the following year and the relationship that followed from that. And I'm just so honored and privileged and lucky to have clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from 1999 to 2000. It was a year that certainly changed my life for the better and led to a lifelong mentorship and friendship. I was so privileged to have her as a friend and mentor and teacher throughout that year and the years that followed. I thought I'd open with a story from my clerkship, and then maybe we could talk a little bit more in depth about the book. When I clerked for Justice Ginsburg in 1999, it was the first time she had cancer. And so it happened that she was diagnosed just weeks before the opening of the term. And she had surgery for the colorectal cancer, which, as you can imagine, is major surgery, about a little over a week before the first day of oral arguments in the fall of 1999. And in the interim days began intensive treatments. So everyone assumed that she wouldn't be on the bench that first day. And there was a tradition, I don't know if tradition is the right word, there's an acceptance that if a justice is ill, they will not come to the bench, but they can listen to the recordings of the arguments and they can still vote and participate in the case. So everyone just assumed that that's what she would do. But they, like myself at the time, didn't really know how tough Ruth Bader Ginsburg was. And I can now say, having known her for 2 decades following that time, I'm not at all surprised. But at the time I was surprised when she called from her car on the way into the court that morning, and I answered the phone, and she said, "Amanda, go tell the chief, I'm coming in." And so I ran down to the Chief Justice's chambers and I said, "Justice Ginsburg will be on the bench this morning." And they were floored. And I have to say, it was an assignment that I relished at the time. And I think back so fondly on all these years later, because I think it's really reflective of who she was. Justice Ginsburg loved her job. She loved being a public servant. She was one of the hardest working individuals I've ever known. Probably, let me restate that, the hardest working individual I've ever known. She was immensely resilient and formidable and tireless and dedicated. And all of that came to the fore there in that moment. And I think many of the American people were able to see that in the years that followed. So she was this extraordinary person, but she was also kind and thoughtful and caring. And when you worked with her or studied her work and her career, you came to realize she was brilliant. So all of this combined made for this extraordinary human being who was a great, great privilege to know. So how did I come to do this book with her? I'm sure you're all wondering. The book came out of a visit of Justice Ginsburg to UC Berkeley in the fall of 2019. That visit originally was supposed to be earlier in 2019, but she fell in the winter of 2018-2019, broke a rib, and doctors discovered that she had lung cancer. So she had to have surgery for that. And I recall calling her saying, boss, I called her boss or Justice, let's postpone. And she said, oh, no, it'll be fine. We can keep going. And so it was really late in the day when we actually wound up postponing the event. Again, another story about her resilience and dedication and wanting to just keep going on, keep moving forward. But she did finally come in the fall of 2019. And one of the reasons she was so committed to giving the lecture in question is because it was a lecture in honor of a woman named Irma Hill Kay. Now, many of you may not know who Irma Hill Kay was, but she was a trailblazer in her own right. And importantly to this story, she and Justice Ginsburg were friends for some 50 years. Together with a third co-author, they wrote the very first book on sex discrimination in the law. And this is in the early 1970s, a crucially important period in the fight for gender equality. They basically launched the ship that Justice Ginsburg takes to the Supreme Court to change the way equal protection is understood in our Constitution, to promise gender equality. And it's for that reason that this lifelong bond between the two of them that was so important to both of them developed. And Irma, it turns out, had been a longtime professor at UC Berkeley Law School, where I now teach, and a mentor eventually to me when I joined that faculty. She was also our first woman dean. She passed away in 2015. So Justice Ginsburg was invited by me to give the first annual Irma Hill Kay Memorial Lecture. And it was so important to the justice to give it. And that's where all of this emanates from. She came, and in the lead up to the lecture, we discussed planning planning the event. And she said, I don't want to give a lecture. I want to do a conversation with you, Amanda. And I said, of course, I would be thrilled. We had done one before, so we had a working model, but we sat down and we really walked through what we wanted to cover in some detail. Anyone who did an event with Justice Ginsburg came to learn that she was meticulous. And so everything was very carefully planned. Our drafts of the conversation went back and forth multiple times. During this time, we decided we had worked so hard on this and we were coming together to honor Irma that maybe we could take the conversation and make it the anchor of a book. So the conversation would span the scope of her life, but then we could include as well materials that complemented what we discussed, and together built around the conversation, laid out for the reader really a roadmap of her life, of what she had done, who she was, what influenced her, and what her hopes and dreams were going forward for this country. And so that's what we tried to do. Now, we wound up publishing the book with the University of California Press, not by accident. They were considering publishing at the time a book that Irma Hill Kay had written called Paving the Way, and both books are over my shoulder. Irma's book, for which Justice Ginsburg had written the introduction, tells the story of the first American women law professors. And the book was enormously important to Justice Ginsburg because it preserved the story of women who had come before her and Irma. However, at the time of our conversation in 2019, 2 years after Irma's death, no publisher had yet grabbed onto the book. So Justice Ginsburg had the idea that we could go to the publisher, we could go to UC Press and say, we want to see you publish Irma's book, but in order to entice you to do so, we have a book that we would like to publish with you as well, and we would like the two books to publish alongside one another. The press, unsurprisingly, went for this, and I'm very proud that both books released alongside one another last spring. The reason that I tell this story is because I think it's a behind-the-scenes window into who Justice Ginsburg was, how important friendship was to her, how loyal she was, and more generally, two important things. One, how important I think it was to her to preserve the stories of the women who came before her, who blazed a trail to open up opportunities for her and for those that followed. And also how acutely aware she was of her power. And she used her power and her position to lift up the voices of other women. And that is one of the most important lessons that she taught me. And that's why I wanted to share that story with all of you. Now, what's in the book? We had, I should say, I certainly had a tremendously great time working with her, trying to decide what to include. She has another book that she published a few years earlier called My Own Words, and it includes a ton of material, a lot of speeches, a lot of briefs and other things, and it's a wonderful archive of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We set out to tell or to assemble something that was a little bit more accessible to the general reader, and that hit the highlights of the different aspects of who she was. So we have a section on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the advocate, in which we have included the very first brief she wrote, pushing for a new construction of the Equal Protection Clause. So in the early 1970s, she comes into an area of law where the Supreme Court has, as recently as 1961, said that the Equal Protection Clause does not protect gender equality and that a woman's place is in the home. This is what the court was saying in the 1960s. So she comes in the 1970s and through a series of landmark cases, argues to the Supreme Court successfully that the Equal Protection Clause promises gender equality to women as well as men. And those victories were monumental for their time. It's hard to overstate how dramatic the changes were to the legal landscape as well as American society as a result of these changes and these victories that were hard won in the 1970s. So we've included, for the first time ever published, the very first brief she wrote together with her husband, Marty Ginsburg, in a case that did not make its way to the Supreme Court, but that is the case at the heart of the movie, On the Basis of Sex, which you might have seen. That movie was written by her nephew. We also include transcripts of her first and favorite oral arguments before the Supreme Court, which we annotated for the general reader to understand the context in which the arguments are taking place. Those arguments were very special to her, and I can talk more about those and her strategy if you're interested in those cases. Next, we've included a section on her time as a Supreme Court justice. And here we see the tireless advocate for equality now wearing the judicial robe. What a lot of people don't realize is that she was a judge for a long time on the DC Circuit before the Supreme Court. So all told, she was a federal judge for 40 years of judicial service and service as a public servant to the American people, something that was really, really important to her. Now, she, as a justice, wrote many important opinions. And here, this was one of the most fun parts of the book to put together. I asked her, I said, if someone were to come who didn't know a lot about your actual decisions, who hadn't actually read them, which decisions, which opinions, more than any others, would you want someone to read? And so those are the opinions that you find in the book. Some of them aren't a surprise. One of them, her great majority decision written 3 years into her tenure on the court in the Virginia Military Institute case. In that case, the court held over only one dissent, that of Justice Scalia, that the VMI school had to admit female cadets who wanted to attend. It was a state-sponsored school, and it had to open up its robust opportunities to women as well as men. The rest of the opinions she chose were dissents. Now, why is that? I think there's no accident. I think the reason she chose dissents is because, remember, we were assembling this in 2020, in the final months of her life. She knew that her time was limited. And although she never said this to me, I surmise that she included the dissents as something of a call to arms, to highlight that there is still a great deal of work to be done, and to give the reader an idea of some of the things that she thought were really important that we needed to keep fighting for. Those include in the book voting rights, gender equality, and reproductive freedom. 3 issues that continue 1 year later, surprise, surprise, to be enormously important and timely. We also included as the final major component of the book, her final speeches given in the last years of her life. And these are really special. In them, you get a window into who her influences were, what made her tick, what drove her through this incredible life, and her family. She talks about her parents and her grandparents coming to this country as refugees. She talks about her love of the United States, which was born out of the fact that the country gave her family refuge and opportunity. She talks with great pride about how a bookkeeper's daughter from the Garment District winds up on the Supreme Court. And I think you get a window into why she was so dedicated to being a public service. In the final speech, she also calls on all of us to continue the work of building a more perfect union. And I think this is the greatest, the most, shall we say, perfect last word to hear from her in the book, because it was so important to her throughout her tenure as a public figure to talk about how it is the responsibility of everyone, not just the justices on the Supreme Court, but everyone, to care about our Constitution and to fight for the vision of the United States, the more perfect union, as our Constitution's preamble references it, that we all want. And she understood how important it was for everyone to fight for that more perfect union. And you hear her calling on us to do that in that final speech. The book also includes an afterword that I wrote after her passing. We turned in the book manuscript only 3 weeks before her death. And so it was in production, and I added the afterword to talk about her passing and being a law clerk at her memorial. In all of this, it's still, even all this time later, hard in some respects to talk about that period and to talk about her passing, which I think, if anything, we continue to feel very strongly in this country. But I'll wrap up by sharing a few things. And I have many, many more things I can talk about, but I want to make sure that I talk about what's interesting to all of you. So let me conclude my opening remarks, and then we'll go to conversation by saying that she was still teaching me. Last 2 summers ago, was as we were working on the book. It's really special to me that 20 years after being her law clerk, I had the opportunity to work with her again. And she was still, just as she had done when I was her law clerk, asking for work when she was in the hospital. Send me pages, just like how she wanted draft opinions when she was in the hospital fighting colorectal cancer 20 years earlier. And she was still very aggressively marking up things that I had written, editing them, making them inevitably better, teaching me to be more precise with my language. The care and meticulousness with which she approached her work was extraordinary. I will say that when she was in the hospital, her assistants actually printed out my cover emails and printed out hard copies of drafts. And not only did I get the hard copies back edited, I also got the emails back edited. So that gives you an idea of just how meticulous she still was, even this is really right near the end. She read the draft introduction that I wrote, and she asked for more discussion of Marty. I love that. I didn't talk a lot about Marty in my remarks. Maybe we can in our conversation, but I love that at the end of her life, she was still thinking about and very much smiling over her love for her lifelong partner, who was a major, major component, as she talks about in the book, to her being able to pursue the career that she did at the time that she did, when so many doors were closed to women. And yet she persevered. But as she tells it, a big part of that success was, and that story was, Marty supporting her all the way unequivocally. I think most of all about our final conversation, in which she asked about my children, and she asked how they were faring during the pandemic. And I think about that a lot, because I think it reflects or it reveals, again, a little bit about her character and the person that maybe the public didn't know, the person who was always thinking about the future and always thinking about others. And I miss her. I miss her terribly. And I'm very, very proud to have played a small part in this book in preserving her legacy and many of the things that she taught me. So I look forward to being in conversation with all of you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I wanted to talk a little bit about the title of the book. You mention it in the afterword. And in case anyone hasn't read the book yet, I just want to quote very quickly. It said, "In trying to process her loss, I kept coming back to the passage from Deuteronomy that hung on a wall in her chambers, 'Justice, justice, thou shalt pursue.' This calling drove Justice Ginsburg in all that she did." I mean, what you just spoke to us about in your opening remarks really speaks to that as well. But I don't know if you would like to talk a little further about like what made you choose that, or is that something she maybe spoke to you about that she would like to call the book? I think it sums up very well the contents of what's inside.
I think it does. And I think it sums up a life well lived. She had that passage hanging on her walls in her office. And in the days following her death, a number of the law clerks, as we were talking to each other, and eventually as I talk about in the book and as in the afterword, and as people saw, we came, even in the middle of a pandemic, pre-vaccine, we all came to Washington to pay our respects. It was just one of those things. I still get emotional all this time later. It was one of those things where I remember my husband said, excuse me, you have to go. Like, we're not going to debate this. And we had not left the house. So, but we, as the clerks, as we were all talking, we all came back to that this was the justice, this passage. And it was so important to her, obviously, that she had it on the wall. Justice is there twice. And if you understand that the meaning behind that, it's because it must be everything. It must be ingrained in you. You must persevere for it. You must pursue it, as the passage says. And I think that really was who she was. This is someone with immense talent, graduated, tied for first in her class at Columbia Law School. We'll put to the side that no law firm in New York City would hire her, but she clearly had extraordinary gifts. And as she told my students in times when she would visit my classes, she believed that when you have these gifts, you have to do something with them to give something back. You have to, as she commonly told my students, make the world better for others. Pursue justice. This is what she did. So very early in her career, you see her pivot from not just studying procedure. She was an expert on procedure. And this is an important component to her success as a litigator, because she really understood how to navigate the courts. But then she takes all those talents and that brilliance and that training, and she hones in on gender equality and spends, the late 60s into the 1970s fighting for gender equality, founding the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and winning these landmark cases. It's hard to overstate how dramatically these changed the landscape of American constitutional law, and meantime American society changes, so that someone born in the 1970s like myself grows up with an entirely different experience than even someone born a decade earlier in terms of opportunities for young women and women. And so all of that drives her. And then you get on the Supreme Court and you read opinions like those we included in the book that talk about the importance of having a constitutional framework that allows every individual to achieve their full human potential. This is one of the phrases she uses in her grand VMI majority opinion. And that really summarizes all that she fought for as an advocate and as a justice, that every individual should have the opportunity to achieve their full human potential. And you see a similar take on that in her masterful dissent. And yes, I'm biased, but it is masterful dissent in the Shelby County voting rights case, a case in which the majority, 5-4, got the Voting Rights Act, takes away the preclearance requirements that are a crucial component to ensuring that we don't see states with a history of voter suppression be able immediately to put in place new laws that suppress the vote based on race. And the majority there strikes down those components to the Voting Rights Act. She writes a dissent in which she says, we should be striving for every individual to have equal citizenship stature. And it's the same idea. Everyone should have a voice in our voting, in our democracy, and we shouldn't be making it easy for states and communities to make it harder for people to vote. That goes against everything that was fought for in the 1960s and in the lead up to the Voting Rights Act. So this pursuit of justice, it really was hardwired in her. And I think, again, it comes back to this point about why she included these dissents. There is so much work left to be done. And she was still fighting right up until the end, but she knew her time was limited. And so here we're left with the dissents that she thinks hit on some of the most important issues for which we need to keep fighting. And we need to keep pursuing that justice.
Yeah. So it is really incredible to think that the justice had this strategy. You know, usually when people write a book, a lot of times they're talking about their greatest, wins, but these are definitely the ones where she had a lasting sort of need to give as much as she could to the next steps. And it's interesting, these cases that are in the book. As someone who worked closely with the justice, are there cases in her past that you would have included that she decided not to?
Oh, that's interesting, because that's a great question. There are some, and there's even the final opinion she wrote was a dissent in a case about reproductive freedom. And I recall not knowing at the time that it would be the final opinion she wrote. I said to her, I really think we should include this one. And she said, no. We've got it covered. We've got it covered. The Hobby Lobby dissent is in there. We're good. There were others I suggested to her, and she was very fixed on these four. It's really fascinating to me. But she wrote opinions on a range of different issues. She wrote really important procedure decisions. I didn't necessarily suggest that we include those because they are more lawyerly, they're less accessible likely to the general reader. And we really wanted this book to be for a general reader. We didn't want it just to be lawyers reading this. So those probably weren't fit to be included, but she has some really, really important procedure decisions, including several dissents in class action cases where the court makes it harder for women to band together to sue their employer for gender discrimination. Dissents where the court makes it harder for people to get into court and sue foreign companies that sell defective products on the American market. Those maybe don't get the headlines, but in the day-to-day life of American justice, they're really important. She wrote a really important opinion in a case called Wesby that involved police accountability. And that's a big issue today. It's a major issue today, right? But the Supreme Court has a number of doctrines that make it very, very hard to sue police officers and make it, and also give police officers a tremendous amount of discretion to stop people and to investigate people. And she was a lone voice in this one case saying, we need to rethink a lot of these doctrines because they're giving the police way too much leeway. So that's another one. I mean, I could keep going. There are a lot of opinions there. In her 40 years as a judge, she wrote over 1,100 opinions. On the Supreme Court alone, she wrote almost 500. So paring those down to 4 was I think quite a chore, but for her it wasn't. These really stood out. These were her favorites.
That's incredible. And you know, for somebody that worked with her, and you talk about her dedication, her persistence, her intensity and passion for what she did, which is, you know, incredibly obvious in her words. She's not one to use superfluous words. And in these selections that are in the book, it's almost as though legal brief written like a poet would choose words for a poem. Every single one of them is doing something. There's no superfluous words, basically. And it's beautiful to read and breathtaking in a lot of ways. And I do think that that's what makes part of what makes this book really incredible and accessible, is that these are written so that the everyday person can understand. Having worked so close with the justice, what was it like to work with her, and what gifts do you think you've taken from her, or that other clerks that have worked with her have taken with them into their careers?
So before I answer that, I have to say, you know, her college professor was Nabokov. And so he always talked about painting a picture with words. And I think one of the reasons she was such a gifted writer is because she trained under him. And she was, as you say, quite meticulous about never use 4 words when 3 will do. And so that is one of the things that every one of her law clerks will tell you she taught us. She would go through draft opinions and she would mark them up by hand. And she typically used pencil, because I think she would then correct her corrections. But she was so meticulous. But you would get back a piece of paper and it would be completely covered. You'd have to kind of get a magnifying glass to see what the text was underneath. And then she would sit down with you and she would go line by line, explaining why she made the changes she did. Now, she didn't need to do that. And I can tell you, not every justice does that with their law clerks. But that was because she was always teaching us. And so another thing that all of her law clerks will talk about is that experience and that investment of time that she made in all of us to make us better writers, to make us better legal analyzers and thinkers, to make us better lawyers. And that was invaluable in terms of the training. But she also taught us about hard work, because, as I said, she worked incredibly hard. She would not send something out unless it was, as she liked to use the phrase, just right. So that might mean, even for a short opinion, 20, 30 back and forth drafts before finally you get one back that says in the corner, just right. And that's when she was saying to you, okay, you can send it to the printer. It's ready to go. We're done. Move on, next case. But this meant for sometimes very late nights, sometimes going over a draft yet again when you really just want to move on, but it wasn't just right yet. So this dedication to get things to the highest level, to stick with it, to work hard, holding yourself to the highest standards, that was something she also taught all of us. And yet she held herself to the highest standards in so doing. And so it wasn't as though she would just sort of leave at 5 and leave us there to toil away. She often stayed up most of the night working. And I have to be honest, I didn't work late very much, but it was just the tenor of the chambers was, you don't leave until the work is done and done well. So you had to hold yourself up. The other thing, though, is that you bring others along with you, like she did. She held herself up to these high standards and brought us along with her. And as a result, taught us really to see what we were capable of and brought out the best in us. And so, you know, I was a college athlete, so I always use sports analogies. It was, I think, what it would be like to play basketball with Michael Jordan. You're at your very best working alongside her because she lifted you up with her. She talked constantly and emphasized constantly precision, particularly in your writing, as we've discussed. Perseverance is something that she taught me, certainly through her example and also through her mentorship and advice. You know, I've had some hard times in my life in the last 2 decades since being her law clerk, and she was always there with an encouraging word. Hang in there. You can do this, very personal exchanges about, one time I went through something she had been through, and, emphasizing you will get to the other side of this, and you will see all these silver linings in the experience that you can't appreciate now. And of course she was right. I think back to when I had my first child, and I wrote her a note and said, I'm terrified about going back to work. I don't know how this whole work-life balance thing is going to work, because now it feels so much more consequential. And she wrote back a one-line response: where there's a will, there's a way. And that to me is quintessential RBG, right? If you look at her life, where there's a will, there's a way. She had all these roadblocks constantly thrown in her path, but she was bound and determined to make a contribution, to use her talents to make the world better for others. And boy, she had that will, and she made her way. And, so that perseverance was really something. She taught me to be kind. She was an incredibly kind, caring person, thoughtful, always there in difficult times. She taught me to make the most of every day. She talks about this in the book, having survived cancer, and Marty's survived Marty's very scary, potentially deadly cancer when they were in law school. She said, you just learn to appreciate and make the most of every single day and not take anything for granted. And, finally, Marty, through watching the two of them interact with each other, she definitely taught me, and a lot of her other clerks have talked about this, to choose a partner who is fully and firmly in your corner, and who is a partner in the truest sense of the word. And, he was extraordinary. He once said, I've been supportive of my wife since the beginning of time, and she's been supportive of me. That's not sacrifice. That's family. That's what you do. And that is such a wonderful, it was such a wonderful thing to watch the two of them interact. They were so wonderfully in love and supportive of each other. And he was a huge deal in his own right, but he was her biggest booster, as she always said. And so that made quite an impression on me. And again, lots of her clerks would say that.
So you kind of talked a lot about how she's so dedicated to the fight. She was always back in action relatively quickly after her stints in the hospital. I know she made it a priority to stay active right up until the very end, and even through cancer. And I have to ask this question because I'm a big fitness junkie. Have you ever done her routine, or did you get her to do that marathon with you?
So I always joked with her, always, when are you going to run a marathon with me? Because that's my hobby on the side. And no, she never did. But when I clerked for her, that's when as she was coming out of recovering from colorectal cancer, that's when she started working out with a trainer. And by the end of the year, she was doing one-arm push-ups. And here I was, a former Division I college athlete, and I couldn't even do one-arm push-ups. I was totally in awe of her. And she kept doing those workouts and kept working with the same trainer all the way through. She even went on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert working out. I don't know if you've seen that. I think it's hysterical. He says, he's trying to make a joke, and he says, what can I call you? And she says, you can call me Justice. And she's very serious. And I think, but I think she was being deadpan. What a lot of people don't realize is that actually she was very funny. And you get a sense of it in the conversation that's in the book. And certainly if you watch the event, you saw it. In any event, I never did actually work out with her, but her trainer did give me a signed copy of the book that he wrote, the RBG workout. And so I have done a few of the exercises and shared the book widely, because I think it's great. She was working out all the way right until she just absolutely couldn't at the end. She actually, during the pandemic, I talked her into getting a treadmill in the apartment, because I said, you can't go to the gym anymore, boss. You got to get your own treadmill. I have my own treadmill. It's great. It's absolutely great. And so she'd get on the treadmill. No, I never did actually work out with her, unfortunately.
So how did she feel? And we kind of like talked about this a little bit before we started, but all the notorious RBG stuff and the merchandise, and there's memes and there's all this fan art. Like, did she enjoy that? Do you think she saw that as an opportunity to reach younger women?
I think she did. I think, I wasn't there the year that she became notorious. It was following the dissent in Shelby County, the Voting Rights Act case. But one of my friends clerked for her that year and said they all had to basically explain to her who the notorious BIG was and what was happening. And it was all a bit of a shock. And those of us who clerked for her before that time, we refer to ourselves as the pre-notorious clerks. We were floored, those of us in that camp, that she would become, someone who would paper the wall behind you, Rory. She was quiet, she was reserved. The way that you would draw her out really was to get her to talk about opera. And so that you learned, if you wanted to see a lively, robust, energetic RBG, you get her to either talk about the law or opera. But otherwise, she was very quiet. And then suddenly she's this larger than life figure. And over time, she did come to embrace it. And I think the reason was exactly what you said. She viewed it as an opportunity to reach a broader audience with her message, not herself. She didn't want to be celebrated. She didn't enjoy being in the limelight. That's not who she was. But it gave her an opportunity to talk about the work, to talk about the pursuit of justice. And in particular, as it grew and grew, you see children's books, I Dissent. You see children dressing up as her at Halloween. To her, I think what was exciting about that is that young girls in particular, but all kids, were learning, if you see something that's wrong, speak up. They were seeing at the same time that an old woman could be a hero or heroine. And that's pretty cool. And a role model. And she could be put on t-shirts, an octogenarian. I mean, who would have thought? But that's pretty cool. And all that represented, I think, to her was something really special, because here we have a woman being celebrated for her intellect in her 80s. We have kids dressing up like her because they aspire to be Supreme Court justices, including little girls. Many of us, well, myself anyway, and women my age, we were born at a time when there had never been a woman on the Supreme Court. And I remember very clearly learning that Sandra Day O'Connor would be nominated to the Supreme Court. And that's the day I decided to become a lawyer. So now we've got little girls dressing up as Supreme Court justices. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And all of this, I think she celebrated. And I think it allowed her, she celebrated for these reasons, but also because it allowed her a bigger platform to talk about that work that we need to keep doing, that work to keep fighting for gender equality. It's not done. There's still a lot of work left to do. The work to fight for voting rights, the work to fight for racial justice, the work to fight for reproductive freedom. As we know all too well, this work is ongoing. And so when she took on that bigger profile, she was allowed a bigger stage really to keep public awareness of how important it is to keep working for all of this. And you highlighted when we were talking beforehand that when I interviewed her, and there are pictures of this in the book, she came out with her notes in a little tote bag. And when we sat down, she placed the tote bag just right so that the audience could see I Dissent, which was emblazoned across the tote bag. And I think this is her way of amplifying all of these things, saying, okay, I'm going to run with this. And since I'm here, and since you all have come here, I want to talk about all this work that remains to be done. And we do a lot of that in the conversation.
So you spoke to how important relationships were to the justice, and even with her clerks, with the people around her. And there's one photo that particularly stood out to me in the book, where she and her fellow Justice Antonin Scalia are dressed up as extras for the Washington National Opera. And I find that that with that they had a very different outlook on the law, often on opposite sides, but they were very good friends. And I do think that it's something that is in this day and age, I think that's something that we find intriguing when political division really does kind of put people at odds. Can you speak to a little of how that friendship and how that relationship developed over time?
It was, you know, a celebration of, or it was a friendship, I think, that we should celebrate in this day and age, because they could not disagree more fundamentally on how to interpret the Constitution and what the judicial role was. And yet they were able to build this bond over a lot of things. So they had been judges together on the DC Circuit, and that's where they meet. But they, you know, they have a lot in common. They're both from immigrant families. They're both from, you know, New York. They both are deeply devoted to their families. They both love the opera. They both love to travel. They both love good food and wine. Right there, you've got a friendship. Oh, and by the way, they're both judges and then justices. A lot of people don't know this, but when the opening came on the Supreme Court that Justice Ginsburg ultimately filled, it came, and people do know this, it came during the Clinton administration. Well, obviously you're going to get a liberal justice. What people, I think a lot of people don't know, is that Justice Scalia called the White House to recommend Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And he knew he was going to get a liberal colleague. He wanted her. He wanted her because he had worked with her. He knew how smart she was. He knew how dedicated she was. And he really liked her. And he wanted to, they worked very closely together. He wanted to work with her again. And so that's, you know, those are the seeds of that friendship. And their families, you know, would celebrate New Year's Eve together. They were all just at the opera together, celebrating Justice Ginsburg's legacy just a few weeks ago. So this friendship was very real. Now, what did it mean in the workplace? This is something that my students always ask, and I talk to them a lot about it because I think it's really important in this day and age to talk about how this translated into the workplace for them. They engaged with one another and they sparred, whether in person or on paper. They always did it respectfully, which I think was really important. It allowed them actually to keep this ongoing dialogue. Occasionally, not often, but occasionally they might convince one another of maybe a small point or even a bigger point. They might impact the way the other thought about something. But even when they didn't, they made each other better. And here's what I mean by that. She gave a talk, and I wish we had included it in the book. This is one of the few things I regret not including. She gave a talk at his memorial service in which she talked about how she sent around her first draft of her VMI majority opinion, an opinion which obviously it's in the book, of which she was extremely proud. This case was so important to her. She finally, as a justice on the court, writing for the court, gets to cite and rely upon all of these cases that she had won in the 70s and effectively overrule one of the cases she had lost. So this is important to her. He sends her an early copy of his draft dissent, and he sends it to her on a Friday night. She says it ruined the weekend. But he sends it to her early before he circulates it around because he says, I want you to have extra time to respond. And at the memorial service, she says, I'm so grateful for that. It was a zinger, yes, but there was a lot in there I had not anticipated and I needed to respond to. And by the time I worked through all of his arguments, the resulting majority opinion that went out under my name was so much better, so much more convincing, so much stronger, that it was inevitably a better product because I had engaged with his arguments. And this is something that's really important because I think through that engagement, sometimes you can win somebody over. I'm sure she would have preferred to get his vote, and she was still trying right up until the end, she says. But even still, we can learn from listening to the other side. And particularly as lawyers, we can make our arguments more convincing if we engage with the other side. Occasionally, we might even pick up a vote. And that certainly was what both of them always hoped for. But they also invested in their friendship because there was this common ground. There was this deep love of country, deep love of the institution that was the court, deep love of the Constitution, even if they read it to mean different things. And that did a lot to help them. And, you know, if you look at the votes, there are a lot of cases in which they voted together. They're not the cases that wind up on the front page of the New York Times. They aren't. But there were quite a few. And so that common ground, I think, helped keep that friendship going.
Something about the justice I've always felt really inspired by was her tenacity, but also her sense of hope. She never appeared to crumble in public when stuff seemed dire, or, you know, with her dissents, they were always so perfectly worded. Instead, she just fought harder, and she remained respectful and kind while also sticking to her guns. Even when Washington started getting really divisive. I'm curious, to what extent was this a persona, or was she always like that behind closed doors as well? It seems she kept going because she truly believed that change was possible, but did she ever worry or doubt that?
She certainly worried, and I think you see that in the dissents. Her dissents, and I'm really glad that they're in the book. Look at, just take Shelby County, for example. There, she says, you, the majority of the court, you're walking this country backward. Okay, that's a pretty powerful statement. There's a lot of anger behind that. It's respectful. She could have said it much, I mean, there are words she could have chosen that would be far less respectful, but it's powerful. And she does not pull her punches. And so, you know, I remember she came to Berkeley on a prior occasion right after the end of that term. And that case was one of the ones that came down at the end. And she talked about it. And she gave a speech. And when she was talking about Shelby County, I remember she grabbed the podium and she leaned forward into the mic and she said, "What has become of judicial restraint?" So that was an angry Ruth Bader. That was as animated and angry as she got. But for her, that was a lot. I mean, that was her way of saying, this is really a huge wrong turn. This is a big deal. And we're seeing that play out right now in real time. It is a very big deal what happened in that case. And just really tremendously unfortunate. It would be hard to overstate how much so, and how much it's affecting voting rights in this country. She saw that in real time. She anticipated it. And so, yes, she worried. She worried there. She worried about reproductive freedom a great deal. And you see that in her Hobby Lobby dissent. She worried about things that, if you listen to the oral argument yesterday, it appears justices on the Supreme Court still don't understand how expensive contraceptive control is. She talks about that in her Hobby Lobby dissent, and how hard sometimes it is to get it, how crucially important reproductive freedom is to women's equality. These are things she, I'm sure, sometimes lost sleep over. And certainly we had conversations where she talked about how upset she was about the direction the country and the court was going in some of these realms. But at the end of the day, she always came back to this optimism, this belief that if we all work at it, we can get there. We can be better. We can accomplish what we set out to do. And I think one of the reasons she was able, despite in the moment being frustrated and worried and even at times angry, to step back and to take in the big picture was because, particularly, you know, when I knew her, this is the end of her life, the last 20 years of her life, 21 years of her life. And particularly as we're having these final conversations, this is the last months of her life. She'd lived almost 90 years. And when you think about what she saw in those 90 years in terms of progress on the racial front, on the gender front, it is nothing short of extraordinary. And so, you know, she gave a speech once in which she said, "I have seen enormous changes in my life. And that is what always brings me back to having hope for the future." And I think that's a really important lesson, because you know, she was on the losing end of a lot of the big decisions in the back half of her tenure on the court. And obviously the court is very different now. So we really have a need, I think, for that hope. But that hope requires hard work. It requires dedication. It requires not just, as she said so many times, relying on the Supreme Court, but getting involved, taking ownership of the Constitution, even if you're not a judge, even if you're not a lawyer, even if you're not in Congress. But just as an ordinary citizen, you have to fight for the Constitution and the country that you want. And I think that's a really timely message.
Absolutely. In fact, I think that we would be remiss to not mention like what is happening in the background right now. And I do think that that is something that I personally, and I know a lot of other folks would like to know is, what would, if the justice was still with us and those lawyers that are working towards social justice, what should we be paying the closest attention to? How can we be as active as possible in these really critical events that are changing as we speak?
So one thing I think she would say, if you go back to her work in the 1970s and speeches and op-eds she wrote, is don't just look to the Supreme Court. It's not the panacea, and clearly it's not in its current form for people who are fighting for progressive social justice issues. She wrote an op-ed in the 1970s in which she said, okay, the court had failed in that particular case to recognize pregnancy discrimination as gender discrimination, because there are both women and men who don't get pregnant. So how can it be gender discrimination? Effectively, the Supreme Court said in two cases. So she and a colleague at the ACLU wrote an op-ed that ran in the New York Times saying, okay, Congress, fix this. The court's messed up, but you can fix this. And Congress amended Title VII to provide that pregnancy discrimination is effectively gender discrimination. And so now the law is fixed. She wrote a dissent in the Lilly Ledbetter case where the Supreme Court failed to recognize 5-4, failed to understand how pay discrimination based on gender works, and shortchanged the interpretation of, again, you know, the gender equality statutes, Title VII and gender equality in the workplace. And she said at the end, Congress, you can fix this. Well, they can't. There are a lot of things that Congress can do. And so an engaged voter can push for legislative change. For example, to take the issue of the day yesterday, Congress can pass a law that guarantees a right to abortion, and that would supersede any state law to the contrary. So regardless of what the court does, there are other forums in which you can fight for things you care about. It's also true that you can fight at the state level. There are state constitutions, there are state courts, there are state legislatures. There are all these different avenues or venues in which we can fight for the country that we believe in. It's not just up to the elite Supreme Court bar and the Supreme Court justices to hash out the kind of country that we want. And I think she would be the first person to tell you that and to remind. I mean, I certainly don't ever want to speak for Justice Ginsburg, but knowing her work and studying her speeches and testimony, I think she would say that when she was at her confirmation proceedings. In her prepared remarks, she talked about how the justices and even members of Congress and the president are not the only guardians of the Constitution. The people are. And so this was, again, a theme she kept coming back to. And it's in that final speech in our book that each and every one of us, regardless of our calling and backgrounds, we have an obligation to care about these things and to do our part to fight for the country that we want. And that's a message that I really just can't think could be more timely. Hope you're muted, Rory.
Sorry. So thank you so much for that. And I think that's a great call to action that we all have a part to play. We're nearing the end of the hour, so I'm gonna kind of wrap things up. I would love to just talk to you all day about about Justice Ginsburg. It's been almost a year now to the day for me since I took on Book Sandwiched In and hosted my first one with a local author. So I just want to say, like, this program is a labor of love. I work very closely with my department head, Seth, and my colleague, Isaac, and people from all sorts of departments throughout the system. And we're all very passionate about what we do with this. But this has been such a special one for me, Amanda, like possibly one of my favorites to host. And it's so special to see. Now I'm going to get choked up. That Justice Ginsburg's been one of my heroes for most of my life. And I just so enjoy being able to hear what it was like to be with her in person. And you're probably the closest I'll ever get to being able to meet her. So this has been really, truly, truly awesome for me. I'm sure probably for Gina as well. If you've enjoyed this discussion today and you're watching, please take a moment to fill out the survey that will pop up when you log off. I personally read all the feedback, and we use that to inform future programs and future services here. And just a little housekeeping, join us again in 2 weeks for the next Book Sandwiched In. My colleague Toby will be talking to poet and author Ravi Shankar about his upcoming memoir, Correctional, which will be out in January. And then I'll also be hosting, I think in 3 weeks, on the 21st, Heidi J. Larson, who is the founder of the Vaccine Confidence Project, a health talk about her book, Stuck, How Vaccine Rumors Start and Why They Won't Go Away, which is another timely discussion. So if any of that interests you, you can check out NHFPL.org. Our calendar is up there, along with all of our other awesome programs. And again, Amanda, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been just so great. And big thanks to Gina for hosting with me. And Gina, I don't know if you had anything else that you wanted to mention.
I would just say thank you so much for spending the time with us. I would echo Rory's, fandom of everything that lawyers and do to reach our social justice goals. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really special.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.